June 24, 1941. Somewhere behind British lines in the Western Desert, the steel was supposed to stop bullets. That was the whole point of armor. But when Allied mechanics test-fired standard rifles at a captured German armored car, they watched rounds punch clean through the sides. 8 millimeters of steel, sloped at aggressive angles, marketed by German propaganda as battlefield protection, was failing against armor-piercing rifle ammunition. The SD-KFZ-222, Germany's standard light reconnaissance vehicle, had a vulnerability that would shock every Allied soldier who discovered it. The vehicle itself looked formidable. Angular armor plates formed a distinctive diamond-shaped profile. The open-topped turret mounted a 20mm autocannon. With a top speed of 80 km per hour, it could appear and disappear across the battlefield faster than most vehicles could react. German crews trusted these machines. They had been told the armor would protect them. What they did not know was that British infantrymen with Lee-Enfield rifles loaded with armor-piercing ammunition could kill them at ranges exceeding 150 meters. The story of the SD-KFZ-222 begins not with its failure, but with the circumstances that created it. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany faced severe restrictions on military development. Tank production was explicitly forbidden. Armored cars, however, occupied a grey area in the treaty language. The Reichswehr, and later the Wehrmacht, exploited this loophole. If they could not build tanks, they would build armoured cars that performed similar reconnaissance and security functions. The development timeline stretched through the mid-1930s as German military planners refined their requirements. They needed a vehicle that could scout ahead of advancing columns, gather intelligence about enemy positions, survive encounters with infantry, and retreat quickly when facing heavier opposition. Speed and mobility took priority over heavy protection. German doctrine assumed that reconnaissance units would maintain distance from enemy forces, observing and reporting rather than engaging in sustained combat. The SD-KFZ-222 series emerged from these requirements. Built on a modified Horch 801 chassis with four-wheel drive and four-wheel steering, the vehicle represented sophisticated engineering for its era. The four-wheel steering system allowed incredibly tight turns, useful for navigating narrow European streets or reversing quickly under fire. However, training manuals specifically instructed drivers to use the four-wheel steering feature only at speeds below 20 km per hour due to stability concerns at higher speeds. From the outside, the vehicle appeared impressively modern for 1937 when production began. The angular armor plates were not merely aesthetic choices, but deliberate design decisions intended to maximize the effectiveness of thin armor through sloping and deflection. German engineers understood that angled armor could cause bullets to ricochet rather than penetrate. The 10-sided open-topped turret, protected by wire mesh screens designed to deflect hand grenades, provided good visibility for the commander and gunner while keeping vehicle weight manageable. The armament evolved during production. Initial vehicles mounted the 20mm K 30 autocannon alongside a 7.9 2mm machine gun. Early production vehicles used the MG-13 machine gun before switching to the superior MG-34 in 1938. The MG-34 became standard throughout most of the war. In 1942, the autocannon was upgraded to the faster-firing Quark 3.8, which offered improved performance against light armor and aircraft. The crew of three operated in cramped conditions. The driver sat in the front hull, peering through a small armored visor. The commander and gunner squeezed into the turret, which was barely larger than a modern compact car's interior. Despite the cramped conditions, crews appreciated the vehicle's mechanical reliability and performance. The Horch V8 engine, available in both 3.5-litre and 3.8-litre variants depending on the model, provided adequate power. The 3.5-litre engine in the Ausf A variant produced 75 horsepower, while the later 3.8-litre engine in the Ausf B variant delivered 90 horsepower. But the critical weakness lay in the armour specifications. The earliest 1938 production vehicles featured 8mm of rolled homogeneous armour on all surfaces, including the front. To put 8mm in perspective, that is roughly the thickness of 4 stacked credit cards. This was armor designed to stop pistol rounds, submachine gun fire, and shrapnel from distant explosions. It could deflect glancing rifle shots at longer ranges, especially when the angular armor caused deflection. Against armor-piercing rifle ammunition fired at perpendicular angles and close range, it was inadequate. German engineers recognized this limitation and made modifications during production. Beginning in 1939, mid-production vehicles received 14.5mm of frontal armor. This offered better protection against rifle fire from the front, though the sides remained at 8mm. The later Ausbau variants introduced from 1942 featured 30mm of frontal armor, a significant improvement. However, by 1942, thousands of earlier vehicles with minimal protection remained in service, and even the improved models retained thin side armor vulnerable to armor-piercing rifle fire. The 5mm armor on the bottom and rear deck was even thinner, sufficient only against indirect shrapnel. German military planners had made a calculated decision that speed and mobility would compensate for limited protection. They assumed reconnaissance vehicles would avoid close combat situations. This assumption proved optimistic when confronted with the reality of World War II combat. German propaganda emphasized the vehicle's protection. Promotional materials distributed to troops showed the sloped armor deflecting fire. Training films assured crews they possessed adequate protection for their reconnaissance role. The psychological effect mattered enormously. Soldiers needed to believe their vehicles offered protection, or they would hesitate to push forward into unknown territory. The angular design looked impressive and modern. The wire mesh over the turret suggested thoughtful engineering. German crews believed in their equipment because they had been trained to trust it. The harsh reality revealed itself gradually as the war progressed. In Poland, in September 1939, the SDKFZ 222 performed admirably. Polish forces, caught unprepared and equipped with outdated weapons, struggled to counter German reconnaissance units. The speed and firepower of the 222 proved decisive. Polish anti-tank rifles existed in limited numbers, and Polish infantry largely lacked armor-piercing ammunition. The vehicles raced through Polish territory, gathering intelligence and creating chaos in rear areas. The early success validated German confidence in the design. France in May 1940 provided similar vindication. French forces, despite possessing heavier tanks and artillery, were outmaneuvered by German combined arms tactics. The SDKFZ 222 excelled in the rapid advance, screening for panzer divisions and exploiting breakthroughs. French infantry, disorganized and retreating, posed minimal threat to the fast-moving reconnaissance vehicles. The campaign concluded in 6 weeks. German crews returned home believing their vehicles were proven combat assets. Senior officers cited the successful reconnaissance operations as evidence that German military technology surpassed that of Western democracies. The Balkans campaign in April 1941 reinforced these perceptions. Yugoslav and Greek forces, equipped with weapons from the previous war, could not effectively counter modern German armor. The mountainous terrain favored lighter, more mobile vehicles over heavy tanks. The 222 performed well in these secondary theatres against weaker opposition. By the spring of 1941, German reconnaissance crews had experienced 3 successful campaigns in which their vehicles had proven effective. They had no reason to doubt the adequacy of their protection. Then came Africa. The Afrika Korps arrived in Libya in February 1941. The formation had been established officially on January 11, 1941, as German High Command responded to Italian military disasters in North Africa. Erwin Rommel, already renowned for his leadership of the 7th Panzer Division during the invasion of France, was appointed commander on February 11th. The first German troops of the 5th Light Division reached Tripoli on February 11th. These initial forces included advance elements of reconnaissance units that would form the eyes and ears of the Afrika Korps. The Reconnaissance Battalion, Aufklärungsabteilung 3, was among the first units to arrive in Africa on February 14, 1941, at Tripoli. This unit, equipped with SDKFZ-222 armoured cars among other vehicles, immediately began deploying into the desert to probe British positions and gather intelligence on enemy dispositions. The 5th Light Division would later be redesignated as the 21st Panzer Division on August 15, 1941, a transformation reflecting the growing scope and intensity of German operations in the theatre. The desert presented unique challenges unlike anything German forces had encountered in Europe. Vast open spaces stretched for hundreds of kilometres, with virtually no cover or concealment. Temperatures soared above 50 degrees Celsius during the day and plummeted near freezing at night. The abrasive sand infiltrated every mechanism, wearing down moving parts and clogging filters. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometres across territory with no infrastructure, making fuel and water delivery a constant challenge. For reconnaissance vehicles like the SDKFZ-222, the desert offered both advantages and disadvantages. The open terrain allowed the vehicle's speed to be fully exploited. Visibility extended for kilometres, enabling reconnaissance crews to spot enemy forces at great distances. The firm sand and gravel surfaces in many areas provided good traction for the four-wheel drive system. However, the lack of cover meant that once spotted, the vehicles had nowhere to hide. The vast distances required more fuel than the limited tank capacity could provide, forcing reconnaissance patrols to carefully calculate range and establish refueling points. The 222 initially performed well in these early months of the Afrika Korps deployment. British forces, caught off guard by the speed and aggressiveness of German operations, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered. German reconnaissance units pushed deep into British rear areas, gathering intelligence on supply dumps, headquarters locations, and troop movements. The speed of the SDKFZ-222 proved invaluable for these hit-and-run reconnaissance missions. Crews could approach suspicious locations at high speed, observe from a distance, and retreat before British forces could organise effective responses. The reconnaissance battalion attached to the 21st Panzer Division operated continuously throughout 1941 and 1942, conducting missions that ranged from simple route reconnaissance to aggressive raids on British installations. Photographic documentation from fall 1941 shows reconnaissance units attached to the 21st Panzer Division in Libya using SDKFZ-222s extensively. These images capture the vehicles in their element, racing across the desert, their distinctive angular profiles silhouetted against the horizon. British forces had been fighting in the desert since Italy entered the war in June 1940. They had developed tactics and gained experience that German forces initially lacked. More critically, British forces were well equipped with modern weapons, including rifles with armour-piercing ammunition. The Western Desert was about to become a brutal testing ground for German equipment, and the SDKFZ-222 would be found wanting. British forces began capturing German vehicles almost immediately. The fluid nature of desert warfare, with rapid advances and retreats across vast territories, meant that damaged or fuel-depleted vehicles were frequently abandoned. The first major haul came during Operation Crusader in November 1941. The operation launched on November 18th with the goal of relieving the besieged garrison at Tobruk. Confused tank battles erupted around Sidi Rezzi as British and German forces clashed in swirling engagements across the desert. On November 27, British forces successfully relieved Tobruk. By mid-December, Rommel had withdrawn to El Agheila. In the aftermath of these battles, dozens of German vehicles lay scattered across the battlefield. Some had been knocked out by anti-tank fire. Others had run out of fuel, their limited range proving insufficient for desert distances. Still, others had been abandoned when their units retreated. British recovery teams systematically collected everything they could find. Among the prizes were several SDKFZ-222s in various states of damage. Standard procedure dictated that captured enemy equipment be shipped to the School of Tank Technology at Chertsey in Surrey for detailed evaluation. This facility, located on Chobham Lane in rural Surrey, served as the primary British centre for analysing captured Axis vehicles throughout World War II. The school was part of the Military College of Science, and would later become the Fighting Vehicles Proving Establishment. Joint teams from the Royal Tank Regiment and RAIM conducted detailed technical analysis of every captured vehicle, producing comprehensive reports on capabilities, vulnerabilities, and tactical implications. However, field commanders needed immediate answers. They could not wait months for reports from England. What weapons could defeat these German vehicles? What were their weaknesses? How should British infantry and anti-tank units engage them? Mechanics and engineers attached to the 8th Army began informal field testing behind the lines, pulling captured vehicles to safe areas to examine them in detail. This pattern of immediate field testing, followed by comprehensive evaluation back in Britain, became standard procedure throughout the war. The most famous example was Tiger 131, the German heavy tank captured in Tunisia in April 1943 during operations near Point 187, also known as Jebel Jaffa. This Tiger had been immobilized by a British 6-pounder anti-tank gun hit that jammed its turret. The crew abandoned the vehicle, which was subsequently recovered by British forces. Tiger 131 was initially examined in Tunisia by British engineers eager to understand German heavy tank technology. The vehicle was then shipped to England, where it underwent months of detailed testing at Chertsey. The comprehensive analysis covered armour composition and thickness, weapons systems, engine performance, transmission characteristics, and every other technical aspect. The intelligence gathered from this single captured vehicle significantly influenced British anti-tank doctrine and vehicle development. The SD-KFZ 222s captured in 1941 and subsequently underwent similar processes, though obviously these light reconnaissance vehicles generated less strategic interest than heavy tanks. Nevertheless, the methodical British approach to captured equipment analysis meant that even relatively minor vehicles received thorough technical evaluation. Multiple SD-KFZ 222s were shipped back to Britain over the course of the war, with each vehicle contributing to the growing body of intelligence on German reconnaissance equipment. The first surprise was the mechanical quality. The Horch 5.8 engine was beautifully engineered with clean castings and precise machining. The four-wheel drive system functioned smoothly even after combat damage and desert conditions. The steering mechanism demonstrated clever design, allowing all four wheels to turn for tight maneuvering. German attention to detail was evident throughout the vehicle, from the quality of welds to the precision of assembled components. These were well-manufactured machines from a sophisticated industrial base. Then the mechanics examined the armour. Using calipers, they measured the thickness carefully and systematically, 8 mm on the sides, 5 mm on the bottom and rear deck. Even accounting for the slope, which added some effective thickness by increasing the distance projectiles had to travel through the steel, these measurements shocked the British engineers. One sergeant, a former auto bodyworker from Birmingham before the war, remarked that he had worked with civilian cars that had thicker body panels. The informal testing began almost casually. Someone suggested they shoot at the vehicle to determine what could penetrate the armour. They started with pistols. 9mm rounds from Webley, revolvers bounced off at all but point-blank range. The armour was performing as designed against pistol ammunition. Next came the Sten submachine gun. The 9mm rounds from the Sten also mostly bounced off, though a few perpendicular hits at very close range managed to severely dimple the armour and cause spalling on the inside surface. Against pistols and submachine guns, the armour worked. Then someone retrieved a Lee Enfield rifle. The standard British infantry rifle, chambered in .303 British, was never designed as an anti-armour weapon. It was simply a rifle, intended for engaging infantry targets at ranges up to 600 metres. The standard Mark 7 ball ammunition featured a 174-grain bullet at approximately 2,440 feet per second. This was typical performance for full-power rifle cartridges of the era, comparable to the German 7.9 2mm Mauser or the American 30-06 Springfield. However, British forces also possessed armour-piercing ammunition for the .303 British cartridge. The W Mark I armour-piercing round featured a 93-grain hardened steel core and achieved approximately 2,500 feet per second. This ammunition was specifically designed to penetrate light armor and had been developed for exactly this purpose. The proof standard for armor-piercing ammunition required that at least 60% of bullets must penetrate 8 mm of armor plate at 175 yards. The mechanics loaded several W Mark I armor-piercing rounds. One of them, who had been a competitive shooter before the war, took aim at the side of the vehicle from approximately 50 yards. He selected a flat section of the hull where the armor was perpendicular to his line of sight, rather than one of the angled sections. He aimed carefully and fired. The armor-piercing round punched clean through. The entry hole was neat and round on the outside face. The exit hole on the interior was jagged and larger, with metal fragments peeled back from the impact. The mechanics gathered around to examine the result, running their fingers over the holes. They fired several more rounds at different angles and distances. At ranges under 100 yards with perpendicular hits, the W Mark I armor-piercing ammunition consistently penetrated the 8 mm side armor. At longer ranges or with oblique impacts, penetration became less consistent, but under typical combat conditions, a British infantryman with armor-piercing ammunition could defeat the armor. The implications spread quickly through the 8th Army. Intelligence officers compiled reports. Tank crews were informed. Infantry units received updated tactical guidance. The supposedly armored German reconnaissance vehicle could be engaged effectively by infantry with appropriate ammunition. British soldiers no longer needed to wait for anti-tank guns or request tank support when encountering SDKFZ 222s. A rifleman with armor-piercing rounds could disable the vehicle and kill its crew. Further testing explored additional weapons. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, a 55 caliber weapon firing 13.9 mm by 99 mm ammunition, achieved 23.2 mm of armor penetration at 100 yards. This was massive overkill against the 222, but it confirmed that British anti-tank rifles would devastate the vehicle. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun, a 40 mm weapon that served as the main British anti-tank gun through most of the desert campaign, could penetrate the 222's armor at any practical engagement range. Tank crews were informed that even their coaxial 7.9 2mm machine guns could penetrate the armor at close range if they concentrated fire on one spot. The knowledge spread beyond British forces. Commonwealth units from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India received similar intelligence briefings. Free, French, forces learned about the vulnerability. As the war progressed and Allied forces expanded, the information proliferated. The SDKFZ 222's thin armor became common knowledge among Allied infantry, fundamentally changing how they approached encounters with these vehicles. Soviet forces conducted their own independent discoveries. On August 23, 1941, the Red Army exhibited a captured German SDKFZ 221 scout car, the smaller predecessor to the 222, near Moscow. On September 7th, one captured SDKFZ 222 was transferred to the gas factory at Gorky for detailed examination. GAZ chief designer Vitaly Grashev and other engineers inspected the vehicle thoroughly, measuring dimensions, testing materials, and evaluating design features. Grachev was particularly impressed by the highly faceted armor plate angled for maximum ricochet effect. Although Soviet engineers had already begun work on their own light armored car design on July 17, 1941, the examination of the German vehicle influenced the final design. The BA-64 light armored car, which entered production in April 1942, incorporated a hull loosely modeled after that of the German vehicle. The multifaceted angled armor plate arrangement was directly adopted from the German design. However, Soviet engineers learned from German mistakes. The BA-64 featured 9 mm of armor on the sides, slightly thicker than the German vehicle, though still vulnerable to armor-piercing rifle fire. More importantly, Soviet designers understood that light armored cars were fundamentally vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons and designed the vehicle accordingly, accepting limitations while maximizing production efficiency. The BA-64 was considerably smaller than the SD-KFZ-222, with a two-man crew instead of three. It was lighter, weighing only 2.4 tons compared to the German vehicle's 4.8 tons. It was cheaper to manufacture, using automotive components from existing Soviet truck and car production. Most significantly, it was easier to produce in large numbers. The GAZ factory at Gorky could manufacture BA-64s on the same assembly lines that produced GAZ-64 Jeeps, sharing components and tooling to accelerate production. Soviet production philosophy differed fundamentally from German approaches. Rather than producing limited numbers of sophisticated vehicles with complex features like four-wheel steering, Soviet factories produced vast quantities of simpler vehicles that were adequate for their roles. Approximately 9,110 BA-64 variants were built between 1942 and 1946. This included 3,901 original BA-64 models from 1942 to 1943 and 5,209 improved BA-64B models from 1943 to 1946. This production total dwarfed the fewer than 1,000 SD-KFZ-222s manufactured over 6 years. The BA-64 remained in Soviet service until the early to mid-1950s, long after the SD-KFZ-222 had been retired from German service. The Soviet vehicle was exported to numerous Allied nations including Poland, Czechoslovakia, China, North Korea, and Yugoslavia, seeing combat in multiple post-war conflicts. Its longevity and widespread distribution stood in stark contrast to the limited production and early obsolescence of its German inspiration. British forces developed their own light armoured cars, including the Daimler armoured car and the Humber armoured car. Both featured significantly better armour protection than the SD-KFZ-222. The Daimler, entering service in 1941, featured 16 mm of armour on the hull sides and 30 mm on the front. This provided genuine protection against rifle fire, including armour-piercing ammunition at typical combat ranges. The Daimler mounted a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, making it far more lethal against enemy armour than the 20mm autocannon of the German vehicle. The contrast between these comparable vehicles highlights how different nations approached the armoured car design challenge. Germany prioritized speed and agility, accepting minimal armour protection. Britain prioritized firepower and adequate protection, accepting somewhat reduced mobility. The Soviet Union prioritized mass production and economy, accepting limitations in both protection and sophistication. Combat experience suggested the British approach was most successful for armoured cars expected to operate in contested areas, while the Soviet approach excelled at providing adequate numbers of vehicles to units that desperately needed them. American forces entering the Desert War in late 1942 conducted their own testing of captured German vehicles. American ordnance teams arrived with scientific methodology, conducting systematic ballistics tests and compiling detailed technical reports. They tested American weapons against German armor to provide tactical intelligence to troops who would soon face these vehicles in combat. The M1903 Springfield rifle, the standard American bolt-action rifle from World War I that remained in service alongside the newer M1 Garand, fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge. The M2 armor-piercing round for this cartridge, identified by its black bullet tip, was specifically designed to defeat light armor. Official specifications required minimum 10.67 mm of armor penetration at 100 yards. Field testing documented penetration up to 12.7 mm at 100 yards, significantly exceeding the 8 mm armor thickness of the SD-KFZ-222. The newer M1 Garand, firing the same .30-06 Springfield cartridge but in a semi-automatic rifle, offered identical armor-piercing performance with the advantage of faster follow-up shots. American infantry could engage German armored cars with confidence using M2 armor-piercing ammunition. The reports noted that German armored cars could be effectively engaged by infantry with standard-issue rifles loaded with armor-piercing rounds, valuable intelligence for troops encountering them for the first time in Tunisia. American testing also evaluated submachine guns and carbines. The Thompson submachine gun, firing the relatively low-powered 45 ACP pistol cartridge, could not penetrate the armor except at point-blank range with multiple hits to the same spot. The M1 carbine, firing the intermediate 30-caliber carbine cartridge, had marginal penetration capability. At close range under 50 yards, it could sometimes penetrate the thinnest rear armor, but not reliably. These tests confirmed that the 8mm armor provided adequate protection against lighter weapons, just not against full-power rifle cartridges loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. The distinction between standard ball ammunition and armor-piercing ammunition was critical. Standard rifle ammunition with lead cores could not reliably penetrate 8mm of steel armor at practical combat ranges. The armor performed as designed against such ammunition. However, armor-piercing ammunition with hardened steel cores was specifically developed to defeat light armor. British, American, and Soviet forces all possessed and issued armor-piercing rifle ammunition to infantry units, particularly in units expected to encounter armored vehicles. The distribution of armor-piercing ammunition varied by unit and situation. Not every soldier carried armor-piercing rounds as standard issue. However, it was common practice to issue limited quantities of armor-piercing ammunition to infantry units operating in areas where they Keepley A2 might encounter light armored vehicles. Squad leaders, designated marksmen, and anti-tank teams routinely carried armor-piercing ammunition. When intelligence indicated German reconnaissance units were operating nearby, additional armor-piercing rounds would be distributed. Impact angle played a crucial role in penetration effectiveness. The SD-KFZ-222's angular armor design maximized obliquity, increasing the effective thickness and encouraging ricochets. A bullet striking at a 60-degree angle from perpendicular had to travel through significantly more steel than the nominal 8mm thickness. This is why German engineers designed the vehicle with angled plates. At extreme angles, even armor-piercing ammunition might glance off rather than penetrate. However, in practical combat conditions, armored cars frequently presented perpendicular or near-perpendicular surfaces to enemy fire. The sides of the vehicle, where the 8mm armor was flattest, were vulnerable whenever the vehicle moved parallel to enemy positions or turned to engage targets. The flat rear deck and rear plates were even more vulnerable. German crews learned to avoid situations where their sides or rear were exposed to enemy infantry, but in fluid combat, such exposure was often unavoidable. By late 1942, the vulnerability of the SD-KFZ-222 was well documented across multiple armies and theatres. German reconnaissance units operating in the desert, in Russia, in Italy, and eventually in France, all faced enemies who understood that rifle fire with armor-piercing ammunition could defeat the vehicle. The writing was on the wall for the 222 in front-line reconnaissance roles. The vehicle that had performed well in Poland, France, and the Balkans, where good roads, weaker opposition, and shorter campaigns had masked its vulnerabilities, was increasingly obsolete against well-equipped Allied and Soviet forces. The thin armor, perfectly adequate in 1938 against the military technology of that era, had become a fatal liability by 1943 as armor-piercing ammunition became standard issue across Allied armies. German military leadership recognized the problem of inadequate reconnaissance vehicle protection by early 1942. Combat reports from Africa and Russia consistently highlighted the vulnerability of the SD-KFZ-222 series to enemy fire. Unit commanders requested better protected vehicles. Crew reports detailed incidents where vehicles were lost to rifle fire or light weapons that should not have been capable of defeating armor. The response was the development of the SD-KFZ-234 series, known as the Puma. This 8-wheeled armored car represented what German reconnaissance doctrine should have specified from the beginning. The vehicle featured 30mm of frontal armor and 14.5mm on the sides and rear, finally providing genuine protection against rifle fire, including armor-piercing ammunition. The sloped armor design maximized effectiveness, and the overall protection could resist most infantry weapons and many light anti-tank weapons. The Puma mounted a 50mm quick 39L60 gun, the same weapon used on later variants of the Panzer III medium tank. This gave German reconnaissance units genuine anti-tank capability for the first time. The 8-wheeled configuration provided excellent cross-country mobility, with the vehicle capable of 85 km/h on roads and maintaining reasonable speed across rough terrain. The crew of 4 operated in significantly better conditions than the cramped 3-man crew of the SD KFZ-222. However, this capable vehicle arrived too late to make a significant impact on German fortunes. Development and production delays meant the first Pumas did not reach frontline units until late 1943. By that point, Germany was fighting desperately on multiple fronts with its industrial capacity stretched beyond breaking. Only slightly more than 100 Pumas had been built by the end of 1943. Production continued through 1944, reaching approximately 400 total vehicles before the production line shut down in September 1944, as Allied bombing and raw material shortages crippled German industry. 400 vehicles could not possibly replace the hundreds of SD KFZ-222s still in service across multiple theatres, nor could they meet the reconnaissance needs of dozens of German divisions. The Puma, despite being an excellent design that finally balanced protection with mobility and firepower, appeared in too few numbers too late to change anything. Meanwhile, less capable but more numerous vehicles like the SD KFZ-222 remained in front-line service because no alternatives existed. Production of the SD KFZ-222 itself ended in late 1943 after approximately 990 vehicles had been manufactured between 1937 and 1943. This production total included multiple variants with evolving specifications. The earliest vehicles from 1937 and 1938 represented the baseline design with 8mm armor throughout and the 3.5-litre engine producing 75 horsepower. The mid-production upgrade in 1939 brought 14.5mm of frontal armor while retaining the 8mm side armor. This modification reflected growing awareness that the vehicle needed better protection, at least from the front where it would most commonly face enemy fire during approach or withdrawal. However, cost and weight considerations prevented upgrading the side armor, leaving the fundamental vulnerability intact. The Aus-B variant introduced in 1942 represented the most significant upgrade. The 30mm frontal armor finally provided genuine protection against rifle fire from the front arc. The more powerful 3.8-litre engine delivering 90 horsepower compensated for the additional weight. The faster-firing Quok 38 autocannon replaced the earlier Quok 30, offering improved performance against aircraft and light armoured targets. These improvements came too late for most vehicles already in service, and even the Aus-B retained the vulnerable 8mm side armour that could be defeated by armour-piercing rifle fire. Related variants in the 2.2 series included the SD KFZ-221, a smaller 3-man vehicle with similar armour issues, and the SD KFZ-223, which was the radio-equipped command variant featuring additional radio equipment but the same vulnerable armour. The SD KFZ-260 and 261 were further specialized command variants. All shared the fundamental weakness of inadequate side armor protection. Many 222s were progressively relegated to rear area security duties, convoy, escort, anti-partisan operations, and training roles where the opposition was less likely to possess heavy weapons or adequate supplies of armor-piercing ammunition. In these secondary roles, the vehicle's speed, reliability, and firepower remained assets. The 20mm autocannon was lethal against unarmored vehicles and effective for suppressing infantry. Against partisans armed with bolt-action rifles and limited ammunition, the 8mm armor might still provide adequate protection. Some vehicles survived until the end of the war in May 1945, though by that point they were thoroughly obsolete for frontline service. The rapid advance of Allied armies in the West and Soviet forces in the East in 1944 and 1945 overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. Reconnaissance vehicles, regardless of type, had limited impact on the final outcome. The war was being decided by tanks, artillery, aircraft, and the overwhelming industrial production of the Allied powers. What made the SD-KFZ-222 particularly significant from a historical perspective was not its combat effectiveness, but what it revealed about military design compromises and the evolution of battlefield technology. The vehicle excelled at nearly everything except the one thing that mattered most for crew survival. It was fast, reaching 80 kilometers per hour on good roads and maintaining respectable speed even on rough terrain. It was mechanically reliable when properly maintained, with the Horch engine proving durable under demanding conditions. The vehicle offered excellent visibility for its crew, critical for reconnaissance work. The commander had good sight lines from the open-topped turret, though this also meant vulnerability to overhead threats like grenades and artillery airbursts. The handling characteristics were praised by German crews, with the four-wheel steering allowing tight maneuvers and quick repositioning. The acceleration was brisk, allowing rapid exits from dangerous situations. The armament was effective for its intended role. The 20mm autocannon, whether the Kwok 30 or the later Kwok K38 variant, could shred unarmored vehicles and was dangerous even to light tanks at close range. The rate of fire allowed sustained suppression of enemy positions. The coaxial machine gun was excellent for engaging infantry and could be used independently of the main gun. Ammunition stowage, while limited by the small vehicle size, was adequate for typical reconnaissance missions. If the vehicle had been equipped with just 12 or 15 millimeters of armor on the sides instead of 8, it would have been significantly more survivable against rifle fire while remaining light enough to retain its mobility advantages. The additional weight would have been manageable. The performance impact would have been modest. But this armor upgrade would have placed the vehicle in a different weight class, requiring a more powerful engine, stronger suspension, and ultimately driving up costs and complexity. This highlights the fundamental tension in armored vehicle design. Every kilogram of armor adds cost, reduces mobility, increases fuel consumption, requires a stronger engine, and creates maintenance challenges. Designers must balance protection against all other requirements. Sometimes the balance works. Sometimes, as with the SD-KFZ's 222, the balance fails, and soldiers pay the price with their lives. The calculated risk that German planners made in the mid-1930s did not pay off. They bet that speed and mobility would compensate for limited protection. They assumed reconnaissance vehicles would operate at standoff distances, observing rather than fighting. They underestimated how often their light-armored cars would find themselves taking fire from rifles at close range. The fluid, chaotic nature of World War II combat, especially in the vast spaces of Russia and the open terrain of the desert, meant that theoretical doctrine about reconnaissance units staying at safe distances rarely matched reality. British intelligence assessments compiled in 1943 for distribution to Commonwealth forces methodically detailed every weakness of the vehicle. The documents specified armor thickness at various points, identified optimal aim points for different weapons, and provided tactical recommendations for engagement. Tank crews were informed they could penetrate the vehicle with coaxial machine guns at close range. Anti-tank gun crews were told not to waste scarce armor-piercing ammunition on armored cars when high-explosive rounds would suffice and were more available. Infantry received particularly detailed guidance. The reports reminded soldiers that their rifles, so often dismissed as inadequate against armor, could be lethal against the German reconnaissance vehicles when loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. Recommended engagement ranges, optimal impact angles, and the importance of concentrated fire were all specified. British training incorporated this intelligence, ensuring that soldiers understood they were not helpless against German armor and possessed effective means of defense. The vulnerability extended beyond armor thickness alone. The open-topped turret, while providing excellent visibility, left the crew exposed to overhead threats. Hand grenades, mortar rounds, and artillery airbursts could kill or wound crew members even without penetrating the hull. The wire mesh screen over the turret opening provided some protection against directly lobbed grenades, but could not stop fragments from nearby explosions. The cramped interior meant that any penetration was likely to cause casualties. With 3 crew members packed into a space barely larger than a modern compact car, a single armor-piercing round entering the crew compartment could wound or kill multiple people. Spalling, where metal fragments broke off the inside surface of armor upon impact even without full penetration, created deadly projectiles that ricocheted around the confined space. The limited ammunition stowage and fuel capacity created additional vulnerabilities. The vehicle could only carry limited quantities of 20mm autocannon rounds and machine gun ammunition. Once expended in a prolonged firefight, the vehicle was defensively armed only with crew small arms. The fuel tanks, while protected by the thin armor, could be ignited by incendiary ammunition or tracer rounds that penetrated the hull. The tires, though puncture-resistant by the standards of the era, remained vulnerable to gunfire. A vehicle immobilized by damaged tires became a stationary target, negating its primary survival characteristic of speed and mobility. Crews disabled by tire damage had to abandon their vehicle or attempt repairs under fire, neither option being attractive when facing enemy infantry with armor-piercing ammunition. German crews, to their considerable credit, continued performing reconnaissance missions with whatever vehicles they were assigned, including the vulnerable SD-KFZ 222s. Many demonstrated extraordinary bravery, knowing or suspecting their armor was inadequate but carrying out orders regardless. Reconnaissance is inherently dangerous work, requiring soldiers to probe enemy positions, gather intelligence, and often sacrifice themselves to provide commanders with information needed for larger operations. The SD-KFZ 222 served throughout the war in multiple theaters, despite its known vulnerabilities because Germany simply did not have sufficient replacement vehicles to retire the entire fleet. Production priorities focused on tanks, assault guns, and other combat vehicles deemed more critical to defensive operations. Reconnaissance vehicles, while important, received lower priority as German industry struggled to replace catastrophic equipment losses on the Eastern Front and to counter Allied strategic bombing. Several examples of the SD-KFZ 222 survive in museums today, preserved as historical artifacts representing German military technology of the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Wheeled Foundation maintains an actual SD-KFZ 222 OSUF-A specimen. The Bovington Tank Museum, the Australian War Memorial, and various other institutions possess examples captured during the war. The vehicle at the American Heritage Museum was captured during the Desert Campaign in 1943 and shipped to England for evaluation at Chertsey. Modern visitors examining these preserved vehicles can see the thin armor plates for themselves, understanding instantly why Allied soldiers found them vulnerable once they began engaging them with armor-piercing ammunition. Running, hands over the 8mm side plates, visitors gain visceral comprehension of just how minimal the protection actually was. The angular design and sloped surfaces that looked impressive in propaganda photographs translate into surprisingly thin metal when examined up close. The SD-KFZ 222 represents a cautionary tale in military vehicle design, illustrating what happens when designers miscalculate the balance between protection and mobility. It demonstrates how vehicles optimized for early war conditions can become obsolete as weapons technology evolves and enemies adapt their tactics. It shows how decisions made at the drawing board in peacetime can have lethal consequences for soldiers years later when those vehicles face combat conditions their designers never anticipated. The story also illustrates the importance of battlefield intelligence and inter-allied cooperation in military operations. The rapid dissemination of knowledge about the vehicle's vulnerabilities across British, Commonwealth, Soviet, and American forces meant that Allied infantry worldwide understood they possessed effective countermeasures. This intelligence sharing prevented unnecessary casualties and increased soldier confidence when facing German reconnaissance units. From a broader historical perspective, the SD-KFZ 222 exemplifies the technological and industrial competition that defined World War II. Every nation struggled to balance competing demands for protection, mobility, firepower, reliability, and cost. Every design represented compromises that privileged some characteristics while accepting weaknesses in others. The SDKFZ-222's particular compromises worked well in the early war period, but failed as the conflict evolved and opponents adapted. The vehicle's story continues to inform modern military vehicle design. Current light armored vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles face similar challenges, balancing protection against mobility and cost. Modern materials like composite armor and ceramic plates offer better protection at lower weight than the rolled homogeneous steel of World War II. But the fundamental tension remains. Every kilogram added for protection reduces mobility and increases fuel consumption. The SDKFZ-222 also serves as a reminder of the human cost of technological inadequacy. Behind every penetrated armor plate was a crew member who believed their vehicle offered protection. German soldiers climbed into these vehicles, trusting that their nation's engineers and military leadership had provided them with adequate equipment. The discovery that this trust was misplaced, that their armor could be defeated by ordinary rifle fire, must have been terrifying. When those Allied mechanics behind British lines in the desert discovered that rifles loaded with armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate the German armored car, they had stumbled upon one of the Wehrmacht's lesser-known vulnerabilities. It was not a war-winning revelation. The SDKFZ-222 was a reconnaissance vehicle, not a tank, and its presence or absence did not change strategic situations. But for individual soldiers facing these vehicles, knowing their rifles were effective weapons rather than useless against armor was powerfully important knowledge. It meant they could fight back. It meant they were not helpless. The 8 millimeters of steel that German engineers believed would provide sufficient protection turned out to be barely adequate against the lightest weapons, and completely inadequate against armor-piercing rifle ammunition. That thin armor, tested in controlled conditions and approved through military bureaucracy, failed when confronted with combat realities where bullets arrived from unexpected angles at close ranges. German crews paid for that engineering miscalculation with their lives. The revelation spread through Allied forces, and the SDKFZ-222, once feared for its speed and firepower, became known simply as another vulnerable target. Not invincible, not even particularly difficult to defeat. Just a vehicle with thin armor that could be penetrated by infantry weapons when loaded with appropriate ammunition. The Emperor had no clothes, and every Allied soldier learned to see through the imposing angular exterior to the vulnerable reality underneath.